The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty street of Millfield as Sarah Chun wiped her hands on her apron for the 100th time that day. At 23, she had already spent 5 years working in the back kitchen of Murphy's Saloon, the rowdiest establishment in this small Colorado mining town. Her calloused hands told the story of countless hours scrubbing pots, chopping vegetables, and cleaning up after the rough miners who stumbled through the saloon doors each evening. Sarah's story began far from the American frontier. Born in Canton, China, she had arrived in San Francisco as a child with her parents during the great wave of Chinese immigration in the 1870s. Her father worked on the railroad until an accident left him unable to continue the backbreaking labor. Her mother took in washing while her father tried his hand at small trade. But life in Chinatown was harsh, and opportunities were scarce for Chinese families. When Sarah turned 18, she heard whispers of work opportunities in the mining towns scattered across Colorado. The pay was better than what she could earn in the crowded streets of San Francisco, and the promise of sending money back to her aging parents was too tempting to ignore. She packed her few belongings into a worn carpet bag and boarded a westbound train, her heart heavy with uncertainty, but determined to make something of herself. Millfield was nothing like the bustling energy of San Francisco's Chinatown. The town consisted of a single main street lined with weathered wooden buildings, their paint peeling under the relentless mountain sun. Murphy's Saloon sat right in the center, its swinging doors constantly moving as miners, cowboys, and drifters wandered in and out. The establishment served as the town's unofficial meeting place, where deals were made, disputes were settled, and news from the outside world filtered through. Patrick Murphy, the saloon owner, was a gruff Irishman with steel-gray hair and hands like ham hocks. He had built his business from nothing, serving rot-gut whiskey and simple meals to men who worked hard and lived harder. When Sarah approached him about work, he looked her up and down with skeptical eyes. Chinese workers were common enough in the railroad camps and mines, but a young Chinese woman working in his saloon was something else entirely. The townspeople of Millfield had mixed feelings about Chinese residents. Some appreciated their hard work and reliability, while others viewed them with suspicion and prejudice. Sarah quickly learned to keep her head down and focus on her work, understanding that her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. She spoke English well enough to take simple orders, but she preferred the safety of the kitchen where she could work without drawing unwanted attention. Her daily routine began before dawn. She would arrive at Murphy's while the building still echoed with silence, lighting the wood stove and preparing for the long day ahead. Breakfast meant frying eggs, bacon, and potatoes for the early risers heading to the mines. Lunch brought a rush of hungry workers, and dinner meant serving whatever Patrick had managed to procure from the local suppliers, usually beef stew, cornbread, and beans. The kitchen was Sarah's domain, though it was hardly glamorous. The room was cramped and poorly ventilated, with a temperamental stove that required constant attention. Grease stained the wooden walls, and the floor bore the scars of countless dropped knives and spilled pots. A small window overlooked the alley behind the saloon, where stray dogs fought over scraps, and drunk miners sometimes relieved themselves against the building. Sarah's living quarters were equally modest. Patrick allowed her to rent a tiny room above the saloon's storage area. The space was barely large enough for a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a small trunk where she kept her belongings. The walls were thin, and she could hear every conversation, argument, and poker game that took place in the saloon below. Sleep often came fitfully, interrupted by the sounds of revelry or occasional violence that erupted when tempers flared and whiskey flowed too freely. Despite the challenging conditions, Sarah took pride in her work. She had learned to cook from her mother, who had adapted traditional Chinese techniques to work with whatever ingredients were available. In Murphy's kitchen, she applied these skills to American frontier cooking, finding ways to stretch ingredients and create filling meals that satisfied hungry working men. Her beef stew became popular among the regulars, though few bothered to compliment the anonymous Chinese girl who prepared it. The social dynamics of Millfield were complex and often tense. The town attracted people from all walks of life: former Civil War soldiers looking for a fresh start, immigrants seeking opportunity, criminals fleeing justice, and entrepreneurs hoping to strike it rich. Chinese workers faced particular challenges, as they were often blamed for taking jobs from white workers and faced discrimination in housing and services. Sarah navigated these treacherous social waters with careful observation and calculated silence. She learned to read the moods of the saloon's patrons, understanding which groups were likely to cause trouble and which individuals should be avoided entirely. Some of the miners treated her with basic courtesy, while others made crude comments or deliberately tried to intimidate her. She developed a thick skin and focused on earning enough money to send home while saving for her own uncertain future. The work was physically demanding and emotionally isolating. Sarah's hands were constantly raw from washing dishes in harsh lye soap, and the heat from the kitchen stove left her exhausted during the sweltering summer months. She had little social interaction outside of taking orders and serving meals. The other women in town, mostly wives of miners and shopkeepers, viewed her with suspicion or outright hostility, seeing her as an outsider who didn't belong in their community. Despite these challenges, Sarah had dreams beyond the kitchen of Murphy's saloon. She had taught herself to read English using discarded newspapers and dime novels left behind by patrons. In her spare moments, she would study these materials, slowly expanding her vocabulary and understanding of American culture. She harbored hopes of eventually opening her own restaurant or perhaps moving to a larger city where opportunities might be more plentiful for someone with her skills and determination. The routine of her days provided a strange comfort despite its monotony. Each morning brought the same challenges and the same small victories. She learned to anticipate the needs of regular customers, preparing their favorite meals before they even placed their orders. Old Pete, a grizzled miner with kind eyes, always asked for extra cornbread. Jake Williams, a young cowboy passing through town, preferred his eggs scrambled soft. These small personal connections, limited though they were, made the endless days feel slightly more meaningful. Sarah also developed an unofficial role as the saloon's unofficial mediator for minor disputes involving Chinese workers. When language barriers created misunderstandings or when conflicts arose between different ethnic groups, Patrick would sometimes ask Sarah to help sort things out. She approached these situations with careful diplomacy, understanding that her actions reflected not just on herself, but on the broader Chinese community in the region. The economic realities of frontier life meant that Sarah's position, while steady, offered little security. She earned enough to cover her basic expenses and send a small amount home to her parents, but saving money for the future proved challenging. The cost of living in Millfield was high, as most goods had to be transported from distant cities. A simple dress could cost a week's wages, and medical care was both expensive and difficult to obtain. Her isolation was perhaps the greatest challenge she faced. Letters from home took months to arrive and were often filled with news of struggles and hardships in San Francisco's Chinatown. Sarah found herself caught between two worlds, no longer truly part of her childhood community, but never fully accepted in her adopted home. She created her own small rituals and traditions, celebrating Chinese holidays quietly in her room and maintaining connections to her cultural heritage through the food she prepared when ingredients allowed. As winter approached in Millfield, Sarah had no idea that events were already in motion that would transform her from an invisible kitchen worker into a local legend. The town was changing, with new arrivals bringing both opportunities and dangers. Some of these newcomers would test the community's fragile peace, while others would challenge long-held assumptions about who belonged in the American West. The first signs of change came with increased activity at the local mine. New investors from back east had arrived with plans to expand operations, bringing in additional workers and equipment. This influx of people meant more business for Murphy's saloon, but it also increased tensions as competition for jobs and resources grew more intense. Sarah noticed the change in the atmosphere, sensing an undercurrent of unease that hadn't been present during her earlier years in Millfield. Among the new arrivals were men who seemed different from the typical miners and cowboys who frequented the town. These individuals wore better clothes, carried themselves with an air of authority, and spoke in whispers about business deals and opportunities. Sarah's position in the kitchen gave her a unique vantage point to observe these interactions, as people often spoke more freely when they believed the help couldn't understand or wouldn't repeat what they heard. One particular group of newcomers caught Sarah's attention through their behavior rather than their words. Led by a man named Jackson Reed, they conducted their business with an edge of menace that made even hardened miners uncomfortable. Reed himself was a tall, lean man with cold blue eyes and a carefully groomed mustache. He dressed like a gentleman but carried himself like a predator, and Sarah instinctively understood that he and his associates represented trouble for Millfield. The local sheriff, Tom Bradley, was a decent man but aging and perhaps not equipped to handle the kind of sophisticated criminal enterprise that seemed to be taking root in his town. He had maintained order through personal relationships and community respect rather than force, relying on the basic decency of most residents to keep serious trouble at bay. The arrival of Reed's group represented a challenge to this informal system of frontier justice. As autumn deepened into winter, Sarah continued her daily routines while remaining alert to the changing dynamics around her. She had survived 5 years in Millfield by being observant and staying out of trouble, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the peaceful monotony of her existence was about to be shattered. The kitchen that had been her refuge was about to become the center of events that would test everything she had learned about survival, courage, and finding one's place in an unforgiving world. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would reveal hidden strengths and transform a quiet kitchen worker into an unlikely hero. Sarah Chun had no way of knowing that her years of patient observation, cultural adaptability, and quiet determination were preparing her for a moment that would define not only her own future, but also the character of the entire community she had slowly learned to call home. The first real sign of trouble came on a cold February morning when Sarah arrived at Murphy's to find the front door hanging crooked on its hinges. Glass from broken bottles crunched under her feet as she made her way through the main room, surveying the damage from what was clearly more than a simple barroom brawl. Tables were overturned, chairs were broken, and the mirror behind the bar showed a spider web of cracks radiating from a central impact point. Patrick Murphy stood behind the bar, his face grim as he swept broken glass into a pile. His left eye was swollen shut, and dried blood crusted his upper lip. When he saw Sarah enter, he managed a weak smile that did nothing to hide his obvious pain and frustration. "Good morning, lass," he said, his Irish accent thicker than usual when he was upset. "Don't mind the mess. We had some uninvited guests last night after closing." Sarah set down her market basket and began helping to clean up without being asked. She had seen the aftermath of fights before, but this destruction felt different. It was systematic and deliberate, designed to send a message rather than simply settle a dispute. As she worked, Patrick explained what had happened. Jackson Reed and his men had arrived just as the last regular customers were finishing their drinks. They had initially seemed interested in playing poker, but their real purpose became clear when they began asking pointed questions about Patrick's business arrangements. They wanted to know about his suppliers, his regular customers, and, most importantly, his monthly earnings. When Patrick politely declined to share such information, Reed's demeanor had shifted from friendly interest to cold intimidation. The conversation escalated quickly. Reed's associates positioned themselves strategically around the room while their leader made his intentions clear. He was offering Patrick a partnership arrangement that would provide protection for the saloon in exchange for a substantial percentage of the profits. When Patrick refused, pointing out that he had never needed protection before, Reed had laughed and suggested that times were changing in Millfield. The violence that followed was swift and calculated. Reed's men destroyed property with professional efficiency while avoiding any damage that would permanently close the business. They wanted Patrick to understand that they could cause much worse problems if their offer was rejected again. The message was clear: accept the partnership or face escalating consequences. As Sarah helped restore order to the saloon, she noticed details that Patrick seemed to have missed. The destruction wasn't random. Certain bottles behind the bar had been deliberately spared, suggesting that the attackers knew which whiskey brands were most expensive. A cash box under the bar hadn't been touched, even though it contained several days' worth of receipts. These men weren't common thieves. They were professionals who understood exactly how to apply pressure without destroying their potential investment. Word of the incident spread quickly through Millfield's small community. By midday, several of Patrick's regular customers had stopped by to express their support and share their own concerns. It became clear that Murphy's Saloon wasn't the only business that had received Reed's unwelcome attention. The general store, the livery stable, and even the local barber had been approached with similar partnership proposals. Sheriff Bradley visited the saloon that afternoon, his weathered face showing the strain of dealing with a problem beyond his usual experience. He was a good man who had kept the peace in Millfield for over a decade, but his methods relied on personal relationships and community cooperation. Reed's organized approach to intimidation required different skills and resources than the sheriff possessed. Sarah listened to the conversation between Patrick and Sheriff Bradley while she worked in the kitchen, her knowledge of English now comprehensive enough to understand the full implications of what she was hearing. The sheriff admitted that he had no concrete evidence against Reed's group, as no one was willing to make formal complaints. The systematic nature of their activities suggested they had experience with frontier law enforcement and knew exactly how to operate within its limitations. During the following weeks, the atmosphere in Millfield grew increasingly tense. Businesses that accepted Reed's partnership arrangements saw immediate improvements in their security, while those that refused faced escalating harassment. Windows were broken, suppliers were intimidated, and customers were discouraged from frequenting unprotected establishments. The strategy was effective because it created economic pressure rather than relying solely on physical threats. Sarah observed these developments with growing unease. Her position in Murphy's kitchen gave her a unique perspective on the changing dynamics of the town. She could see how the fear was affecting people's behavior, making them more suspicious of strangers and more hesitant to speak openly about their concerns. The sense of community that had characterized Millfield was being systematically eroded by Reed's campaign of intimidation. Patrick's situation became increasingly precarious as Reed's pressure campaign intensified. Several of his regular suppliers began experiencing mysterious problems with their deliveries, forcing him to pay higher prices for goods from more distant sources. Some of his steadiest customers started drinking elsewhere, claiming they were concerned about the safety of their families if they continued frequenting an unprotected establishment. The financial strain began to show in Patrick's face and demeanor. He started working longer hours, trying to compensate for reduced income by cutting expenses wherever possible. Sarah watched him struggle with pride and practicality, understanding that accepting Reed's terms would compromise everything he had built over years of honest work, while refusing might result in losing his business entirely. One evening in early March, Sarah was cleaning the kitchen after a particularly slow day when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. 3 of Reed's men had entered the saloon after closing time, finding Patrick alone as he counted the day's meager receipts. She pressed herself against the kitchen door, listening through the crack as the men delivered what sounded like a final ultimatum. Reed's lieutenant, a scarred man named Dutch Morrison, explained that their patience was running out. Patrick had been given multiple opportunities to accept their reasonable business proposal, but his stubborn refusal was becoming an embarrassment that couldn't be tolerated indefinitely. They were prepared to make one final offer, with terms that were substantially less generous than their original proposal. Patrick's response was respectful but firm. He appreciated their interest in his business, but he had managed Murphy's Saloon successfully for 15 years without outside assistance. He saw no reason to change an arrangement that had served him and his customers well. He hoped they could respect his decision and find other opportunities more suited to their particular talents. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as Dutch Morrison's voice took on a harder edge. He explained that Patrick seemed to misunderstand the nature of their offer. This wasn't a negotiation between equals, it was a choice between cooperation and consequences. Businesses that refused to participate in the new economic arrangement found themselves facing problems that could be very expensive to resolve. Sarah's hands trembled as she realized the full implications of what she was hearing. This wasn't just another attempt at intimidation. It was preparation for something much more serious. Morrison's tone suggested that Reed's group had decided to make an example of Patrick's continued defiance. The kitchen hand who had spent 5 years avoiding trouble was about to witness the kind of violence that would force her to make choices she had never imagined. The conversation ended with Morrison giving Patrick 48 hours to reconsider his position. After that deadline, they explained, the situation would be resolved through alternative methods that might prove unpleasant for everyone involved. The men left without further threats, but their quiet confidence was more intimidating than any shouted warnings could have been. Sarah spent a sleepless night considering her options. She could continue keeping her head down and hope that whatever happened to Patrick wouldn't affect her directly. She could pack her belongings and leave Millfield before the situation escalated further. Or she could find some way to help the man who had given her steady work and treated her with basic human dignity when others in the town had viewed her with suspicion or outright hostility. The next morning brought an unexpected development that would change everything. Sarah arrived at the saloon to find Patrick sitting at the bar, staring at an envelope that bore the official seal of the territorial government. The letter inside informed him that his property had been selected for acquisition under eminent domain proceedings, with compensation set at a fraction of its actual value. The legal documents were signed by officials whose names Patrick didn't recognize, but the implications were clear enough. Reed's organization had apparently gained enough influence with territorial authorities to use legal mechanisms as weapons against stubborn business owners. Patrick's choice was no longer between accepting a partnership or facing harassment. He was being given the option to sell cheaply or lose everything through legal confiscation. The systematic nature of this new pressure revealed the true scope and sophistication of Reed's criminal enterprise. As Patrick struggled to understand the legal documents, Sarah realized that her quiet observations over the past months had given her knowledge that might prove crucial. She had seen Reed's men meeting with strangers who dressed like government officials. She had overheard conversations about property values and development plans. Most importantly, she had witnessed interactions that suggested corruption extending far beyond Millfield's borders. The kitchen that had been Sarah's refuge was about to become her strategic headquarters. The young woman who had survived by remaining invisible was preparing to step into the light and take actions that would determine the fate of everything she had learned to care about. The legend was about to begin, though none of the participants yet understood the roles they were destined to play. That evening, as Sarah prepared what might be Murphy's last meals in his own saloon, she made a decision that would transform her from observer to participant. She had spent 5 years learning how to survive in Millfield by understanding people and situations. Now she would discover whether those skills could be used not just for survival, but for fighting back against injustice. The quiet kitchen hand was about to become a force that Jackson Reed and his sophisticated criminal organization had never encountered before. The deadline Morrison had given Patrick was rapidly approaching, and Sarah knew that time was running out for subtle solutions. Whatever action she took would have to be decisive, carefully planned, and executed with the kind of precision that Reed's men thought only they possessed. The woman they had dismissed as invisible help was preparing to demonstrate that underestimation could be a fatal mistake in the unforgiving world of the American frontier. The plan that formed in Sarah's mind was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its potential consequences. She had spent 5 years observing the patterns of life in Millfield, learning who could be trusted and who posed dangers. More importantly, her position in Murphy's kitchen had given her access to conversations and information that even Sheriff Bradley didn't possess. She knew things about Reed's operation that could destroy him, but only if she could find a way to act on that knowledge without getting herself killed in the process. The key insight came to her as she watched Patrick struggle with the legal documents that threatened to steal his life's work. Reed's organization was powerful because it operated in shadows, using intimidation and corruption to avoid direct confrontation with law enforcement. But their strength was also their weakness. They had become overconfident in their ability to control situations through fear and manipulation. They had never encountered resistance from someone they considered beneath their notice. Sarah's first step was to visit Sheriff Bradley privately at his home, arriving just before dawn when the streets were empty and no one would witness their conversation. She had rehearsed what she would say, knowing that she would have one chance to convince him that a Chinese kitchen worker might hold the key to solving Millfield's most serious crisis in decades. The sheriff answered his door in his nightclothes, clearly surprised to find Sarah on his porch at such an early hour. His initial reaction was polite confusion, but his expression changed as she began describing what she had overheard during Reed's visits to Murphy's saloon. Her English was clear and precise as she detailed conversations about bribery, property manipulation, and plans for expanding their criminal enterprise to other mining towns throughout the territory. Sheriff Bradley listened with growing amazement as Sarah revealed the scope of her knowledge. She had memorized names, dates, and specific details that painted a comprehensive picture of Reed's organization. Her invisible status had allowed her to witness meetings and overhear planning sessions that would have been impossible for any official investigator to access. The sheriff realized he was looking at the most valuable witness in the territory, hidden in plain sight as a humble kitchen worker. The evidence Sarah provided was detailed enough to support criminal charges, but Sheriff Bradley faced the same practical limitations that had frustrated him throughout the crisis. Reed's group had carefully avoided actions that would provide grounds for arrest, and their influence with territorial officials made conventional law enforcement approaches dangerous or ineffective. They needed a strategy that would expose Reed's crimes while protecting both Sarah and the broader community from retaliation. Sarah had anticipated this problem and proposed a solution that demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking. She suggested using Reed's overconfidence against him by creating a situation where he would be forced to act openly, in front of witnesses who couldn't be intimidated or bribed. The plan would require precise timing, considerable courage, and the kind of marksmanship skills that Sarah had never mentioned to anyone in Millfield. The sheriff's surprise deepened as Sarah explained her proposal. Reed's organization planned to take control of Murphy's saloon within the next 24 hours, using violence if necessary to force Patrick's compliance. Sarah suggested allowing this confrontation to proceed, but under controlled circumstances that would ensure justice rather than simply another criminal victory. The plan was dangerous, but it offered the only realistic hope of ending Reed's reign of terror without waiting for help from distant authorities who might never come. That evening, Sarah made final preparations for what she knew would be the most important night of her life. She had spent the afternoon practicing with a skill she had learned from her father, but never thought she would need in America. During their difficult years in San Francisco, he had taught her to shoot with an old revolver he had acquired for protection in Chinatown's dangerous streets. Sarah had natural talent and steady hands, but she had never fired a weapon in anger or desperation. The rifle she selected belonged to Patrick, who kept it behind the bar for emergencies that had never materialized during his 15 years in business. Sarah tested its weight and balance, adjusting the sights according to calculations she had made earlier. She would have one opportunity to act, and everything depended on her ability to make a shot that would save lives while demonstrating that Reed's organization wasn't invulnerable to resistance. As darkness fell over Millfield, Sarah positioned herself in the storage room above Murphy's kitchen, where a small window provided a clear view of the saloon's main room. Sheriff Bradley had hidden himself in a position where he could witness events without being detected, ready to act when Sarah's plan reached its conclusion. Patrick knew only that help was coming, though he couldn't imagine that his salvation would depend on the quiet Chinese woman who had worked in his kitchen for 5 years. Reed arrived precisely at the appointed time, bringing 6 men who moved with the professional efficiency of experienced criminals. They entered Murphy's saloon like predators claiming territory, spreading out to control the room while their leader confronted Patrick with an ultimatum that admitted no compromise. The performance was calculated to demonstrate Reed's power while eliminating the last symbol of resistance to his authority in Millfield. Sarah watched through her window as Reed's speech unfolded exactly as she had predicted. He spoke about business realities and the changing nature of frontier life, explaining that successful entrepreneurs needed to adapt to new circumstances or risk losing everything they had built. His tone was reasonable and almost friendly, but his men's positions around the room made the underlying threat unmistakably clear. Patrick's response showed the dignity and courage that had made him a respected member of Millfield's community for over a decade. He acknowledged Reed's power and organization, but maintained that some principles were more important than profit or even survival. He had built Murphy's saloon through honest work and intended to keep it operating according to those same standards regardless of the consequences. The moment Sarah had been waiting for arrived, when Reed's patience finally snapped. His civilized facade disappeared as he signaled his men to begin the systematic destruction that would force Patrick's compliance. Violence erupted with shocking suddenness as Reed's organization abandoned intimidation in favor of direct action designed to break their victims' will and serve as an example to anyone else who might consider resistance. Sarah's rifle spoke once from the storage room window, its sound echoing through Millfield's quiet streets like thunder announcing a storm. The shot was perfectly placed, striking Reed in the shoulder and spinning him around before he crashed into a table, sending cards and coins flying across the floor. The precision of the shot demonstrated skill rather than luck, and its placement showed an intention to disable rather than kill. The psychological impact of Sarah's intervention was immediate and devastating for Reed's organization. His men had prepared for various forms of resistance, but they had never considered the possibility that their carefully planned operation could be disrupted by a single shot from an unexpected direction. Their leader's confident authority evaporated as he writhed on the floor, bleeding from a wound that proved their group's vulnerability to skilled opposition. Sheriff Bradley used the confusion created by Sarah's shot to enter Murphy's saloon with his weapon drawn, finding Reed's men disoriented and unsure how to respond to a situation they hadn't anticipated. The evidence Sarah had provided gave him legal justification for arrests, while Reed's wounded condition made resistance impractical. The criminal organization that had terrorized Millfield through careful planning and systematic intimidation collapsed within minutes once their aura of invincibility was broken. As Sheriff Bradley secured the prisoners and attended to Reed's wound, Sarah emerged from her hiding place to face the consequences of her actions. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, transforming herself from invisible observer to active participant in Millfield's most dramatic confrontation. The kitchen worker who had survived by avoiding attention had just guaranteed that her name would be remembered throughout the territory. Patrick's reaction to learning that his salvation had come from his own kitchen was one of amazement mixed with profound gratitude. Sarah had risked everything to save his business and possibly his life, demonstrating a loyalty and courage that went far beyond any employment relationship. The quiet woman he had barely noticed during 5 years of daily interaction had revealed herself as someone capable of extraordinary actions when circumstances demanded them. The news of Reed's capture spread through Millfield before dawn, carried by witnesses who had heard the shot and seen the aftermath of Sarah's intervention. The story grew with each telling, as people struggled to process the reality that their salvation had come from the Chinese kitchen worker whom many had barely acknowledged as a member of their community. The woman they had dismissed as invisible help had proven herself capable of actions that none of them could have imagined. Reed's wounded pride proved as significant as his physical injury. During his recovery in the town's makeshift jail, he repeatedly demanded to know who had shot him, unable to accept that his sophisticated criminal enterprise had been defeated by someone he had never bothered to notice. His assumption that effective resistance could only come from other professional criminals made Sarah's intervention particularly humiliating and psychologically devastating. The legal proceedings that followed Sarah's dramatic intervention revealed the full scope of Reed's criminal organization. The evidence she had gathered during months of careful observation supported charges of extortion, bribery, conspiracy, and attempted theft through fraudulent legal proceedings. Territorial authorities who had been corrupted by Reed's influence found themselves exposed and facing their own criminal charges as the investigation expanded beyond Millfield's borders. Sarah's testimony during Reed's trial established her as a key figure in territorial law enforcement efforts. Her detailed knowledge of criminal activities and her ability to provide precise, credible evidence made her invaluable to prosecutors working to dismantle the broader criminal network that Reed had established. The kitchen worker who had remained invisible for 5 years became a celebrated witness whose courage had made justice possible. The transformation in how Millfield's residents viewed Sarah was dramatic and permanent. The woman who had been tolerated as necessary help became a respected member of the community whose opinions were sought on matters of local importance. Her demonstration of loyalty, courage, and exceptional skill had earned her a place in the town's social structure that transcended the racial prejudices that had previously limited her opportunities. Patrick's gratitude took practical form as he made Sarah a partner in Murphy's saloon, recognizing that her contribution to saving his business entitled her to share in its ownership. The arrangement provided Sarah with financial security while acknowledging her new status as someone whose judgment and abilities commanded respect. The kitchen that had been her workplace became the foundation for a business partnership based on mutual trust and shared experience. The rifle shot that had ended Reed's reign of terror became the centerpiece of a legend that spread throughout the mining territories of Colorado and beyond. Stories of the Chinese kitchen worker who had saved an entire town from criminal domination inspired other communities facing similar threats, while demonstrating that heroism could emerge from the most unexpected sources. Sarah's actions proved that courage and skill mattered more than social status or ethnic background when communities faced genuine crises. Years later, long after Reed had served his prison sentence and disappeared from the territory, visitors to Millfield would still ask to meet the woman whose single shot had created such a dramatic legend. Sarah would smile politely and direct them to Murphy's saloon, where she continued to work alongside Patrick, serving meals and maintaining the establishment that had become a symbol of successful resistance to criminal intimidation. The legend of Sarah Chun, the kitchen hand who became a hero, represented something larger than one woman's courage in a moment of crisis. Her story demonstrated that the American frontier offered opportunities for transformation and achievement to those willing to work hard, observe carefully, and act decisively when circumstances demanded extraordinary measures. The shot that made her famous had also made her free, transforming her from an invisible worker into a celebrated example of the frontier's democratic promise that anyone could become someone through demonstrated merit and proven worth. Sarah's legacy in Millfield extended far beyond the dramatic events of that February evening. She had proven that effective resistance to injustice could come from unexpected sources, and that community defense sometimes required individuals to step beyond their assigned roles and take actions that others couldn't or wouldn't attempt. The kitchen hand who had become a legend had also become a permanent reminder that heroism was defined by actions rather than social position, and that true courage often emerged from those whom society had trained itself not to see.